Hello, everyone, and welcome to MAP Forum. I'm Nagar Rokar, and I have the pleasure of hosting the weekly webinars for the Medici Archive project. Tonight, I'm honored to have Paul KALPAN with us. He's a professor and chair of art history at Purchase College at State University of New York. He's also a major contributor to the multi-volume book titled The Image of the Black in Western Art. I myself have been immensely influenced by his scholarship, so I can't wait to hear all about his talk today. Professor KALPAN, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Nagar, thank you. I'm going to share my screen.
Of course, screen is yours.
And get started. Let's see, wait a minute. I think I want this. Is that looking good?
Beautiful. Thank you.
In that case, here I go. Both Venetian and Florentine art from the later Middle Ages up to the 18th century offer substantial arrays of images of people of Black African descent. It's not moving.
Do you want to click on the screen itself?
There we go.
Okay.
It's fine. Both Florence and Venice had a visible Black African presence in their populations, especially beginning in the later 1400s, and they also occasionally hosted Black Christian pilgrims and diplomatic visitors. Although there are certainly areas of similarity in images of the story of the Magi, in the frequency of depictions of Black people as servants to local elites, the Florentine and Venetian visual record reveals significant differences in the choice of subject matter incorporating Black characters, in the characterization of iconographic details, and in the timing of surges of interest in Black figures. While the focus in this talk will be imagery, a realm where figures of color are especially easy to discern, the Venetian and Florentine state archives and certain other collections of documents and texts, as well as early modern printed books, also provide important information that allows us to better understand the meaning of the visual imagery. I need to say a few words about how I came to this general area of research and to specifically today's topic, especially since I'm not myself a person of color. The study of European images of people of sub-Saharan African descent, and I will use the term Black to signify such people in this talk, was initiated in the very early 20th century by an African-American scholar, Freeman H.M. Murray, and amplified by the famous Harlem Renaissance intellectual Alain Locke in his The Negro in Art of 1940. By the 1950s, not only Black researchers, but also white American scholars, interested in trying to unearth the roots of racism, began to undertake in-depth research on American imagery in the 18th and 19th centuries, and one of these was my father, Sidney Kaplan, who collaborated, along with my mother as well, who collaborated on two groundbreaking museum exhibitions at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, 1964, and the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. in 1973. As a teenager in the 1960s, I became a sort of research assistant, charged with looking into the European antecedents of American imagery, a task that I found so absorbing that it eventually became the subject of an undergraduate thesis, then my doctoral dissertation, and then in 1985, a book drawn from the dissertation. Meanwhile, an ambitious research project entitled The Image of the Black in Western Art was founded in the 1960s by the French-American philanthropist Dominique de Menil and publications by an international team of scholars began to slowly emerge from this in the 1970s and 80s. I joined the project, by then based at Harvard, in 2006. The project's vast photo archive has two versions, one at Harvard and the other at the Warburg Institute in London. And I'm actually just back from a fascinating conference at the Warburg, which took the photo archive itself as its conference theme. One of the many virtues of the photo archive, with tens of thousands of images, is its international scope. But in-depth research, of course, often needs to focus on particular places and times. And in my case, after publishing a book about the development of Black characters in the Adoration of the Magi story across many European regions, I turned to Venice because I knew its artists repeatedly represented Black figures and because I had easy research access to the city. My first employer, Wake Forest University, owned and still owns a study center there. I published several articles about Black characters, in particular Venetian Renaissance paintings, but eventually in 2002 to 3, when I became a project scholar for the African American artist Fred Wilson's installation at the Venice Biennale, a project that astutely and creatively retrieved, reimagined, and critiqued Venetian depictions of Black people. After my participation in this, I began to think more carefully about the effect created by a large body of images in a particular city. I started to compile a list of all Venetian images of Black Africans. And recently, this has led to, for me, a very different kind of publication. African Venice, Venezia Africana, a 2024 guidebook to the Black presence in Venice, with special attention to visual art, produced with my co-author, Shaul Bassi, a professor at Ca' Foscari University of Venice, and incorporating short contributions by distinguished scholars and creative writers, white and Black, American, British, African, and Italian. The volume in two separate language editions that you see here was published by the firm Wetlands in Venice in 2024, and the English edition was reissued by Penn State Press in 2025. If you want to get hold of it in the UK or the US, the Penn State edition is what you'll look for. My principal role in the volume was writing a series of 10 detailed walking tours of the city and its peripheries, each one exposing the visitor to a range of different characterizations of the role of Africans, primarily in works of art. I'm a guidebook addict. You can see my TCI guides behind me in red. And the idea of making a small contribution to the genre was thrilling, and I soon began to think of where else the template might work. Rome, for example. But before that idea could take shape, I was contacted by the director of the Palazzo Medici Riccardi Museum in Florence, Dottoressa Valentina Zucchi, about a different sort of undertaking. And we are now preparing an exhibition on the Black African presence in Florentine art and society during the Medici era, that is from the late Middle Ages to the early 18th century, to open in the spring of 2027. And all this is a very roundabout explanation for why I'm speaking to you today about both Venetian and Florentine images of Black people. The two cities, powerful and wealthy republics in the later Middle Ages, obviously had cultural elements in common, and on the whole, were more likely to be allied than otherwise during the long and complex history of Italian politics. They both established far-flung commercial and financial ventures. Furthermore, Giotto's revolution in painting had a profound influence on the course of Venetian art, even if the two cities ultimately maintained distinctive visual traditions. But three very obvious differences need to be affirmed here. Venice's early history as a Byzantine possession has no parallel in Florence. Florence remained technically within the Holy Roman Empire, as the city of Venice did not, and Venice retained its republican government, whereas Florence, after 1530, became a state governed by a dynasty. Due to its Byzantine heritage, as well as its close commercial links with Alexandria in Islamic Egypt, Black characters appear much earlier in Venetian art than they do in Florentine. There are at least 7 Black figures still visible in the medieval mosaics and enamel work inside the Basilica of San Marco, dating to between the early 12th and 14th centuries. The largest of these are 2 men in the Pentecost dome, in the nave, Black Egyptians who are among the people to be converted by the Holy Spirit through Christ's 12 apostles. And they're one of these little pairs of figures around the periphery. This replicates Byzantine Universalist imagery, the whole world is ready to be evangelized, valuable as a metaphor for the multi-ethnic populations of the Byzantine Empire. And Venetians saw this imagery as useful in the multi-ethnic state and commercial network it was already constructing. Florence never established such a multi-ethnic state, but its commercial network similarly expanded in the Trecento, and its population of enslaved people from around the Mediterranean and beyond increased significantly during that century. There may be some correlation between this fact and the appearance of a notable fresco by Andrea da Firenze of the Pentecost in the 1360s in the chapter house of Santa Maria Novella, which included a Black African among people of various ethnicities. But this adoption of Byzantine Universalist iconography appeared not in a state church like San Marco in Venice, but in the meeting room of a Dominican monastery, where the theme was probably understood as more narrowly theological rather than political. In Florence, there are few surviving images of Black people that predate Andrea da Firenze's. One of the earliest I know, from the 1320s, is Giotto's Trial by Fire in the Presence of the Sultan, a fresco in the Bardi Chapel in Santa Croce. This is not Giotto's first attempt at an image of an African. That would be his circa 1305 mocking of Christ in the Arena Chapel in Padua. Had Giotto gone to see the mosaics of San Marco in nearby Venice, as he probably did, he would have seen something analogous in the circa 1200 or 12th century depiction of St. Mark in Alexandria being dragged to his martyrdom by a Black African, among others. Other images of Africans as persecutors and torturers of Christian saints were then emerging in France as well, probably in response to both the conflicts of the Crusades, where Black soldiers were encountered in Islamic armies, and to a longer tradition of associating darkness with evil and the demonic in Christian theology. While Mark would have been martyred long before the rise of Islam, Venetian artists were already beginning to characterize, anachronistically, Mark's Egyptian opponents as Muslim. In Giotto's Paduan Mocking, the hostile Black figure who raises a rod to beat Christ wears white robes, like the Black Egyptians in the Venetian Pentecost mosaic. Like the Black Egyptians in the Venetian Pentecost mosaic, already associated such white robes with garments in the Islamic Middle East. Back in Santa Croce, the foremost of Giotto's two black men at the Egyptian sultan's side also wears white. But the meaning of the two figures here is more ambiguous than Giotto's figure in Padua. They are undoubtedly part of the sultan's entourage, and they wear turbans, just becoming a fundamental sign of Islamic identity in European art. But they seem ambivalent about what is unfolding. Francis walks through the fire to prove the superiority of his faith. The Sultan's philosophers flee, but the two African men and the Sultan seem to be still processing the miracle. The men's faces are among the first European images of Black Africans to show some degree of individuality. Blackness as an attribute of Muslim identity had a long later history in both Venetian and Florentine art, but I'm not claiming Florentines always took a more nuanced approach. For example, around 1500, the Florentine Biagio d'Antonio's Way to Calvary features a turbaned African who drags Christ along and holds the nails with which he will be affixed to the cross. Whereas in the Venetian painter Marco Marziale's 1506 Supper at Emmaus, the turbaned black waiter is a curious bystander, emphasizing the Middle Eastern setting without suggesting hostility to Christ. It is, however, instructive to compare the two Florentine and Venetian monuments with the largest representations of Black Africans. And these the figures are much larger than life size. Pietro Tacca's so-called Quattro Mori, a celebration of Grand Duke Ferdinando I's pacification of piracy in the Mediterranean through the commercial expansion and militarization of the port of Livorno, where the work was erected in 1626, undoubtedly had an impact on the design of the tomb of Doge Giovanni Pesaro in the Church of the Frari in Venice of 1669. Both deploy colossal figures of subjugated Islamic enemies using dark materials, bronze and black marble, to signify otherness. However, the four Frari figures, sculpted by Giusto Lacour and Melchior Bartel, are uniformly grotesque, trapped forever in their painful task of supporting the effigy of the Doge, right, who is placed above them. These men seem to be enslaved for eternity. Now, the same might be said of Tacca's bronze captives, who show the most explicit marker of enslavement, chains, but Tacca's figures are more individualized. In fact, only one of them bears the features Europeans then associated with sub-Saharan ancestry, characteristic forms of hair, lips, and nose. The term Moro, Moor, applied to the monument, sometimes signifies blackness, but was also frequently used to denote Muslims in general or those from Northwest Africa. The one clearly Black African captive here was based on the sculptor's life studies of a galley slave named Morgiano, housed in a slave hostel near the monument. And the figure's body and facial expression articulate psychological rather than physical distress. Not long after the completion of Tacca's monument, some viewers began to remark that the work showed greater interest in and sympathy to this figure and the other captives than to the stolid portrait of Ferdinando by another sculptor. And even Ferdinando's powerful widow, the Dowager Grand Duchess of Tuscany, Christina of Austria, seems to have countenanced the making of, and presumably enjoyed, a painted parody of this monument. In her retirement villa just outside Florence, known as La Quiete, serenity, stillness, the witty painter Giovanni Manozzi frescoed the ceiling of a major room with an allegory of stillness. A lovely young woman, a flattering stand-in for the aging Christina, seated on a cloud, holds delicate, tiny chains attached to four men, denoting the potentially turbulent winds which she has quieted, a metaphor for her political skill in avoiding civil conflict during the reign of her young son and then grandson. One of these personifications of the winds is a handsome young black man whose ethnicity is specified in the painting's written program. But the clever courtier who wrote the program did not invent such a character. Instead, he drew on a much earlier medieval tradition of depicting the winds from all quarters of the earth as human heads, usually 8 or 12 of them, but sometimes only 4, and including at least one black wind, usually associated with the south or the east. A Byzantine world map of this kind was replicated in Venice in the 1450s, and both Venetian and Florentine mapmakers sometimes accepted this idea in both manuscript and printed world maps. The most unusual Venetian articulation of this imagery is found not in a map of the world, but rather in Jacopo de Barbari's famous bird's eye view of Venice from 1500. There, the head of a winged child, the head of a child at the bottom of the print, the south wind, and you can see this south wind more clearly, is given the hair, lips, and nose commonly associated with Black African identity in this period, as if to suggest that the ethnic diversity of the world as a whole is also present in cosmopolitan Venice. As of 1500, Venice indeed had a visible population of both enslaved and emancipated Black Africans, notably among its many gondoliers, a group we shall soon turn to. First, however, I want to consider the heraldic or emblematic use of Black figures, which the depictions of Black winds somewhat suggest, especially when they are reduced, as in de Barbari's print, to an isolated head. The European system of heraldry emerged in the 12th century, and by the late 13th or early 14th century, the heads of Africans had become a widely accepted heraldic device, used to denote aristocratic families as well as certain European cities and provinces. We don't yet really understand exactly why this imagery emerged or what it might have signified early on. It may have had multiple meanings in individual contexts. In Florence, the head of an African wearing a light-colored headband inscribed with repetitions of the letter T on its side started to appear in the Trecento as the coat of arms of the Pucci family. But in the late 1500s, the Albertinelli family used precisely the same device, and one 17th century author reported the opinion that the Albertinelli had preceded the Pucci in using it, even inscribing it on a Florentine city gate near their residence. A similar heraldic motif seems to have been used in the Quattrocento by at least one other Florentine family, besides the Pucci and Albertinelli, and confusingly, there are two other early Florentine paintings, a predella panel from the Trecento and a cassone chest from the Quattrocento, which I show you here, in which the head of a Black African, and there are multiple, but this one here is probably the clearest, in which the head of a Black African appears as the arms of persecutors, either of Christian saints or pious Old Testament Hebrews, which is the case in this work. Piero della Francesca used the motif in this pejorative way as an emblem, in this case of a pagan Persian ruler, in his frescoes at San Francesco in nearby Arezzo. In Florence, the use of the heraldic device by the increasingly wealthy and Medici-affiliated Pucci family is by far the most visible. At the Palazzo Pucci, on where else, the Via dei Pucci, and in the Church of Santissima Annunziata, which they patronized. At Santissima Annunziata, the entire facade is stamped with it, walls, vaults, pavement, so that the device even seems to rival the terracotta roundels of infants on Brunelleschi's adjoining Ospedale degli Innocenti. So here's the corner of the Santissima Annunziata with the Pucci arms, and then it transitions immediately to now a white figure on a dark background, the infant in the roundels of the Ospedale. It's also present in the most famous painting commissioned by a Pucci patron, Palaiolo's St. Sebastian shot with arrows from 1475 in the form of little roundels over here on an ancient Roman triumphal arch in the background. Occasionally, the normally simplified and restricted heraldic imagery of the black head was developed into something far more complex. This is the case with a remarkable detached fresco of about 1635, once in the Palazzo Pucci, painted by the same Giovanni Manozzi who authored the fresco of the winds at La Quiete. Here we have a whole person, naked from the waist up, seated on another cloud, like the winds at La Quiete, with a family motto, Candida Praecordia, or white at heart, inscribed above. That motto, of course, testifies to ambivalence about a white family's using a black figure to embody their lineage. While the headband with the letters T reminds us of the details of the Pucci heraldic device, the active pose and longer hair humanize this figure. The red and white striped garment covering the lower body is also an interesting element, especially if we understand the figure to be female. The Venetian painter Titian had used a similar striped textile in the dress of a black nymph attending the goddess Diana in an influential picture of 1559. Black women do appear in both Florentine and Venetian art, but they are distinctly less common than black men, even though the domestic slavery that prevailed in the two cities and that primarily brought Africans to them was primarily female. An equally striking articulation of the Florentine heraldic device with a black African head belongs not to the Pucci, but to the Albertinelli, and was not made in Florence or even by a Florentine artist. This is the so-called Mohrenkopf Pokal, a silver, gold, and bejeweled drinking vessel made by Christoph Jamnitzer of Nuremberg around 1600 for Carlo Albertinelli, an extremely wealthy and successful Florentine merchant long resident in Nuremberg. The naturalism and three-dimensionality of the object brings it to vivid life, but this is disturbingly undercut by the absence of a body. Carlo Albertinelli died north of the Alps, and this rather chilling piece of metalwork never made it to Florence. But the Albertinelli arms can still be seen in an underground room of the Florentine Church of San Lorenzo. Meanwhile, in Venice, there's nothing comparable to the Pucci and Albertinelli arms, an absence which is itself striking. One way of explaining this is that a dynasty which was an early rival of the Venetian Republic, the Carrara of Padua, had made use of the device not as their principal heraldic emblem, which was a schematic four-wheeled cart or carro, but as a secondary heraldic signifier, often placed above the coat of arms itself in the helm area. And here you can see it, this black face emerging from the helm. In 1405, the Venetian Republic utterly defeated the last Carrara lord of Padua, Francesco II, annexed his territory and murdered him and other members of his family, and banned the display of Carrara heraldry. It would perhaps not have been opportune for any Venetian family to display this device. However, other non-heraldic uses of the head of an African do appear in Venice. One turns up on one of two carved Trecento capitals for Venice's ducal palace, along with other ethnic heads that signify the diversity of those who trade with the Republic, a sort of secular reworking of the Pentecost mosaic. There's also an impressive carved relief of the head of an African inside the Church of San Michele in Isola from the late 1400s, but there's no consensus yet on its intended meaning. Occasionally, the figure of a black African appears near a coat of arms, as in the center of Paolo Veronese's huge 1582 Triumph of Venice in the Ducal Palace, where a black page is placed just above the arms of the reigning Doge Niccolò da Ponte of the bridge, thus the device here. But that's as far as things go. Veronese's black page can serve as a transition toward an especially important genre of black figures in both Venetian and Florentine art, that of the elaborately dressed black attendant to members of local elites. While it's not true that most enslaved Africans brought to Italy ended up in the service of the most wealthy families, there's no question that black domestic servants were often much sought after by them. And this was a fashionable European practice that dates back to Sicilian kings and German emperors of the High Middle Ages. In the Quattrocento, this kind of imagery typically appeared within works with sacred subjects, which were nevertheless embellished with the pageantry of contemporary social display. The classic example in Florentine art is Benozzo Gozzoli's 1459 set of paintings of the journey of the Magi for the chapel inside the Palazzo Medici. A teeming crowd of the three kings' retainers includes portraits of the leading members of the Medici family, Cosimo here, for example, as well as their allies and subordinates, and conspicuous in the foreground is a highly individualized black man in fashionable contemporary dress, including bicolored hose, who holds a longbow. So far, however, it has not been possible to identify any black Africans in the Medici household in this early period. And I've raised the possibility that this might be a reference to a black man called Sebastiano, known to have been in the service of the Cardinal of Portugal, who was in Florence right around this time. The bow might be a punning reference to the unsuccessful attempt to martyr St. Sebastian by shooting him with arrows. Indeed, it was through Florentine commercial connections with Portugal that enslaved African people were trafficked to Florence in the second half of the Quattrocento. That Portuguese West African trade also brought black people in great numbers to Venice, beginning in the 1470s, and by the end of the century, there was a visible population of black gondoliers in the lagoon city. This is attested by letters and a passage in one of the earliest guidebooks to Venice, and also by the two black gondoliers in Carpaccio's Miracle of the True Cross of 1494, one over here at the margin, but one in the foreground. Which incorporates at the lower left a crowd filled with portraits of the members of the board of the religious confraternity for which it was made. So both pictures, the Guazzoli and the Carpaccio, have their kind of group portraiture of important white folk. One of the two gondoliers is, like the bowmen in the Palazzo Medici, very much in the foreground, uh, and arrayed in beautiful garments typical of gondoliers in the service of affluent Venetian families. Gondoliers were essentially very similar to the footmen employed by the wealthy in other Italian cities like Florence. It is harder to tell if Carpaccio's figure was meant to be recognized as a particular individual, but it was then quite common to encounter black boatmen on the Grand Canal and elsewhere. In the 16th century, the preference for black African servants only increased among elites, and by the 1520s, Titian had established the idea of including a young black page as a secondary figure in portraiture. But his first version of this was for a non-Venetian patron, and only in 1558 do we have a surviving example made by him for someone in Venice, portrait of Fabrizio Salvarezza, a wealthy grain merchant. The function of the secondary figure was to direct attention back to the main subject, and they were often placed uncomfortably close to the edge of the composition as if to emphasize their marginality. The Medici in Florence, by now having achieved the status of Grand Dukes, were mostly reluctant to share space in their official portraits, even with humble retainers. But an exception was made in the portrait by Giusto Sutermans of a very young prince, Francesco, from the early 1630s. Here, and this seems to be typical of Medici court practice, the black attendant is not a child, but a young adult. However, his marginalization is retained by having him sit unobtrusively on the ground in the corner. He is, however, painted with immense care and reads as much more of an individual than the stiff Medici princeling he attends. A few years later, Sutermans undertook a very different kind of multi-person portrait, known in two excellent autograph versions. And I have better slides of the one recently acquired by the museum in St. Louis. Here, two peasant women who are named in the sources, who supplied fresh food to the Medici suburban villas, are grouped with a black man called Pietro Moro, whose subdued but elegant garments and pearl earrings mark him as belonging to a more privileged status as courtier. While many Africans at the Medici court in the mid-17th century were probably enslaved, Pietro Moro received a regular salary and must have been free. Pietro both engages visually with the viewer and also mocks the two women by filching a piece of food over here and with his other hand making an obscene gesture on the shoulder of this woman. This work's comic content is a recently developed turn in Italian art toward associating blackness with entertaining, or what were perceived to be entertaining, violations of decorum. I juxtapose Suterman's work with a mid-18th century picture by another artist who delighted in the comic, the Venetian Pietro Longhi. Longhi's messenger is dominated by an imperious black figure dressed in rich but somewhat exoticized garments, who may also have been understood as comic in his overblown pomp. The performative aspects of these works are related to another activity characteristic of court retainers, involvement with musical spectacles. In Bonifacio de Pitati's circa 1535 Venetian canvas, Lazarus and the Rich Man, a tiny black child does no more than hold up a musical score for a quartet or a group to play. However, as the Medici court during the 1650s and early 16 at the Medici court during the 1650s and early 1660s, a probably enslaved man known both as Giovanni Buonaccorsi and Giovannino Moro became a notable performer of operatic and dramatic roles, even to the point that the painter Volterano portrayed him with another esteemed court musician called Panbolito. Buonaccorsi was famous enough that he was loaned by Cardinal Giancarlo de' Medici, in whose household he served, to a theater in Venice for a season, one of the few cases where we can trace a connection between actual African individuals in Florence and Venice. I began this section with a look at the prominent Black attendant in Gozzoli's Journey of the Magi, and it's now time for a further consideration of the story of the Magi as a venue for the depiction of Black characters. The biblical passage, which is the foundational text of the story, says only that they came from the east. Theological commentary eventually opened up the possibility that the wise men might embody different global regions. But the first Black Africans to be included in visual images of the episode appear as attendants to three white magi. Nicola Pisano, in his 1266 Siena pulpit, may have been the first to depict Black Magian attendants. By the 1370s, there's a Florentine example, and Lorenzo Ghiberti put such a figure in the Magi panel of his first set of bronze doors for the baptistry, installed in 1424. And there are numerous other Florentine examples, including Gozzoli's from later in the Quattrocento. Venetian artists borrowed this Tuscan innovation, as one can see if you look carefully here or over here at the right. I'm not finding that one, but we'll stick with this figure. As one can see in Antonio Vivarini and Giovanni Dallamagna's picture from the 1440s. The actual introduction of a Black African magus in art, however, took place in Germany in the late 1300s and early 1400s. And the Italian artists who first adopted this innovation after 1450 worked in the regions of Lombardy, Emilia, and Piedmont. Both Florence and Venice were initially largely resistant, though that resistance was more noticeable in Florence due to the immense cultural political importance of the Magi story in the city. Briefly, the veneration of the Magi was imported from Milan to Florence in the Trecento, and annual processions on their feast day, January 6th, became increasingly splendid. The group responsible for them, the Compagnia dei Magi, became, like so much else in Florence, dominated by the Medici, and of course, members of Florentine elites, including the Medici, marched in the procession and could even impersonate the Magi. This pageantry must have encouraged the creation of many splendid pictures of the story, which provided room for portraiture of local elites and their retainers, but mitigated against any transformation of a magus into an African. By the 1490s, some lesser Florentine painters were experimenting with a Black magus in mostly small pictures, but it was not until 1511 that this step was taken by a major artist in a major work, easily visible to a wide audience in Florence. Andrea del Sarto's Arrival of the Magi in the frescoed forecourt of Santissima Annunziata. It may not be a coincidence that this work was created while the Medici were still in exile. Two features are worthy of note. The Black magus is accompanied by the more familiar motif of several Black Magian retainers mixed into the crowd. And here's one, and here's another. Right? And the Black magus is not the youngest of the three, but rather seems to be middle in age, older, middle-aged, younger. The most comparable Venetian work, that is, a first large-scale public articulation of the Black magus, is the set of sculpted Magi of about 1500 who performed their adoration hourly on the Torre dell'Orologio in Piazza San Marco. These works were originally executed by members of the Ranieri family, but their kinetic function and outdoor exposure necessitated a remaking in the 1700s, probably very close to the original. Here, the Black Magus is youngest in age and emphatically third in line, the most common position in German and other European art, and indeed the standard in later Venetian works. There's no entourage here because of the special technical circumstances, but subsequent Venetian painters of Black Magi usually included an entourage with one or more black attendants. In Florence, however, the particular notion of a middle-aged Black Magus remained an option in the 16th and 17th centuries, such that a Florentine play of the Magi from 1641 speaks of Re Vecchio, Re Moro, and Re Giovane. I've tried to show a great many works in this presentation, in part to make the case that the visual archive of Black characters in both cities is extensive and varied. But of course, I've inevitably left out significant works in both cities that are less adapted to comparative analysis. I want to close with one final pair depicting men of power that may seem a bit mismatched, but is nevertheless illuminating. Bronzino's portrait of Alessandro de' Medici, the first Medici Duke of Florence, and a detail from Paolo Veronese's Marriage at Cana from the 1560s. As is well known, the illegitimate Alessandro was the son of an enslaved mother who may well have been of Black African descent, though the evidence is incomplete. His portraits provide varying degrees of visual confirmation for this idea. While at least one Venetian patrician is known to have had a child with a Black female servant, Alessandro's example cannot really be paralleled in Venice, in part because there wasn't a ruling dynasty. But Venetian artists and their patrons could certainly conceive of a Black aristocrat, since such a person, in a gorgeous green outfit of Middle Eastern cast, is seated at the wedding feast of Cana, a picture otherwise filled with details from contemporary life, including many Black waiters. This final pair of works can serve to summarize the range of sacred and secular artworks we've considered and the manifold problems of using visual imagery to establish group identity, both on the part of the artists and ourselves. In the end, what I hope I've demonstrated is not some rigid set of distinctions between Florentine and Venetian imagery, but rather how a comparative method can illuminate the nuances of Italian images of Africans. Thanks.
Remarkable talk. Thank you so much, Professor Kaplan, for this wonderful presentation. Now the Q&A session is open. If you have any questions, you can write it in the Q&A box and I can write them to Professor Kaplan. But until we receive questions, I am going to start with my own questions, if you don't mind.
I don't.
Thank you. Thank you. So in the specific cases of Venice and Florence, how do you think that the differing economic and political orientations of the two cities, saying, Venice's maritime, mercantile, and Florence's, banking spheres and, diplomatics, how do you think these differences shape the iconographic roles that the artists in two cities assign to the Black figures?
It's a very complicated question. I mean, I would say, first of all, that I cannot show in the Florentine images of Africans much of a particular connection to banking, right? Venetian maritime commerce is implicated, especially in images of figures who were placed in Alexandria, right? And certainly Egypt is one of the places where Venetian travelers, Venetian merchants, become familiar with people of color before they constitute a significant population in Venice itself. Florence, of course, doesn't have that same trade with North Africa, Its relations with North Africa are more often hostile in some ways, though it's worth pointing out that in addition to um, the West African slave trade bringing Black people by force to Florence, we also have evidence, especially in the later 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, of trans-Saharan trade on the Libyan
Mhm.
coast that brought such slaves, not just to Florence, but to other parts of central Italy, less frequently to Venice. So in some of the trade networks, we can see a connection to the northeastern Africa, or we can see in Florence a connection to parts of the central North African littoral rather than the eastern part. I don't know in the end that that necessarily shapes the particular representation. Okay. Um,
Mhm.
but it certainly is worth understanding as part of the underlying, commerce in human beings that
Mhm.
underlies, as I've tried to show, a lot of the imagery.
Right. Yeah. We do have a couple of questions, but just this is just a follow-up. So you do think that this reflects that kind of local encounters in Venice and Florence between
I do. Even when the imagery is quite fantastic, as for example is the case here, right?
right.
Um, Uh, I think that uh, local encounters have to be understood. Well, among other things, we know that both Florentine and Venetian artists wandered around the city looking for models of non-European peoples, and in particular Black people.
Right.
There are affirmations of this in biographies of Veronese and also of a 17th century Florentine artist. Um, so we don't want to understand this work only as being copied from other works. The iconographic traditions may have rolled on, but I think it's pretty clear that artists were looking to supplement their knowledge of the appearance of Black people through those that they saw in the cities. Now, did the roles that Black figures played always drive this? In the case of servants to the elite, I'm sure it did.
Hmm.
In the case of sacred imagery, it's much more complicated,
Of
I
course.
would say. Maybe I'll leave it
Okay.
there.
Thank you.
Good
That was a
questions.
very illuminating response. Yeah, we have how many? 8 questions.
Wow.
So yes, phenomenal. So Carolyn asks, do you have dates for 2027 exhibition in Florence? That was my question too.
That's easy. I don't have the exact date yet, but it will be late March. It'll open late March or April, and it will run well into the summer. I think at least through July.
Wonderful. Elizabeth asks, can you work Frederick II Stupor Mundi into the Venice Florence story?
Sorry, can I work what?
Frederick II Stupor
Oh,
Mundi
I
into the
I, I,
Venice and Florence story.
I can. Although it might drive me to give another 45-minute lecture. Very briefly,
We're happy to host you.
very briefly. Um, we don't really understand the origins of the heraldic use of Black figures, but my working hypothesis is that it stems from the time of Frederick II, and that both in Germany and Italy, those using the device of a Black figure or a Black head are imitating Frederick's display of Black people and his use of them in various kinds of imagery in the early 13th century, right? So, especially in the Florentine situation, I suspect that these things go way back to Holy Roman Imperial Hohenstaufen sources. And it's quite interesting to me that this crops up again in a way in the Albertinelli head, the silver gilt work that we looked at, which was a traditional Florentine emblem, but which was now being deployed in a much more grandiose way in Germany, where, in a sense, the motif had perhaps originated. So that's a tiny little bit. I hope eventually in the museum catalog to expand on those ideas. But I do think that Frederick II plays a fundamental role.
Thank you. Patricia asks, first, thank you for the interesting talk. On the Gozzoli, which you placed in Florence, I suspect that his library actually indicates that he is accompanying the Sforza prince behind him. As you know, Milanese imagery later in the century certainly depicts Black figures in Sforza service. Any thoughts?
So it's a possibility. I wouldn't exclude it. Um, the Sforza are about to make much of this. Um, uh, the great bulk of Sforza imagery and the data that we have about their Black servants is later than 1459. Sorry, yeah, later than 1459. Especially during the time of Lodovico il Moro, so from the 70s through the 80s, and especially in the 1490s. Um, uh, Milan is another case, right? And has its own parameters. But the fact that the Black figure in the Medici chapel is placed so close to Cosimo seems potentially significant to me. Um, and that the figure should only denote Sforza. Well, I'll keep an open mind and think about it very carefully. But uh, that might be an issue.
Thank you. Just so we have 3 more minutes, and we have three more questions. Maybe
I'll be
two.
quick.
So yes, Dana asks, are you familiar with the African American J.A. Rogers book, "And Nature Knows No Color Line"? And are you aware that the heraldic device was often associated with variants of the name Mori or Moro? Also interesting to note that the white headband is still by the Black or Berber population of southern Morocco. The Siwa, Oasis, and the Yemen is it mentioned by the Greeks as characteristically worn by the Maori. It is mentioned
Yeah.
by, so it's
That
mostly
that's
common.
that that's all great, and I wonder if the questioner won't send me some material about the latter stuff. J. Rogers was in a way where I got started on this, and I'm so glad that someone has mentioned him. He's another one of the more or less self-taught Black historical researchers from the early and actually mid 20th century. He wrote a series of incredible books trying to unearth Black history in Europe and elsewhere. And these were books that I looked at in my father's study in the 1960s and were one of the other things which drove me to this kind of study. I don't think I have time to respond to the rest of it, but those are all very interesting suggestions.
Right, yes. So the next question is, when did the slave market in Venice begin to sell Black Africans rather than Tartars?
There wasn't a slave market, kind of a permanent location of a slave market in Venice, as there were in some other European cities. Think of Lisbon, for example. But I think the earliest sale that we have a record of is from the 14th century, 1360s, no, maybe 1380s. I'm not completely certain, but in the latter half of the Trecento. Um, but things really pick up in the last third of the 15th century, especially with regard to slaves of African origin.
Thank you. Um, so the next question is by Michael. In Head of an African from the Capitol in the exterior arcade of the Palazzo Ducale, Venice, mid 14th century, it has a defaced, broken nose. Many statues of the 15th and 16th century were defaced by chopping off their noses. Any ideas why this image was damaged this way?
Yeah, in looking at it for this presentation, the same question occurred to me, and I don't have an answer for it, but it's unquestionably worth considering. Um, I'd have to look at other heads from that capital to see whether there's similar damage. The capital is now stored in the museum inside the Ducal Palace. There's a copy on the exterior, but it's a great question, and I'll look into it.
Right. And the question by Chloe, thank you for a great talk. How do you navigate analyzing representations of Black people that incorporate observed, fantastical, and stereotypical imagery, especially as such works move transnationally?
Wow. um, uh, yeah, that might stump me because it's such a big question to answer in a few seconds. Uh, I will say that, in looking at this imagery, one sees both traces of careful delineation of individual features by artists, Gozzi in particular, comes to mind here, and also the replication of very standardized notions of Black African identity, um, focusing again on things like complexion, hair, lips, nose, but also, as you can see in this work here, the roundness of the forehead and sometimes cheekbones. So there are unquestionably these norms that emerge quite early and that are remarkably long-lived. In fact, I'm not sure we're beyond them yet. But it's always a balance. And one of the things that I often argue with other scholars about is this a normative image or is this something indicative of particular study based on an individual? And the answer is often different for different examples. It's not the full answer that question deserves, but I think that's
Right.
as
Yeah,
far
I
as I
have
can go.
actually. Right. I'll provided your email and our
I
email
would be
if there are
happy
any
to hear
follow-up
from anybody.
questions.
Yes.
Right. Yes. Thank you. So the next question is by Linda. Isn't the black figure next to Cosimo in Gozzoli's Adoration his illegitimate son?
Uh, but I doubt it, right? Um, there is an illegitimate child in the family, but the slave is described as Circassian, meaning from the Caucasus region, and would not have had this kind of appearance.
Mhm. Wonderful. Thank you so much. We unfortunately we ran out of time, but again, I'm happy to forward your questions to Professor Kaplan, or if you want to directly contact him, he has been generous enough to offer that. So we can take it to our emails, and I truly hope that we can host you one more time in the future. I enjoyed immensely from this talk, and I'm sure our audience did as well. Thank you so much, Professor Kaplan, for joining us tonight and sharing your insight on this fantastic topic. And thanks everybody for joining this session tonight. Next week, we have a special event with three fellows from the Medici Archive project. They're going to share their projects and their findings. So please join us same time, same link, and I hope to see you again next week. Thank you again, Professor. Have a good evening.
Thanks a
Bye
lot.
bye, everyone. Good
Bye
night.
bye.
Good night.